All right, everybody, welcome back once again. If you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead and check out my website, www.danceofthecosmos.com. Again, my name is Dan Hendricks, and this is part 4.4 of our Grahas series, and we're looking at the planets. In this particular part of the series, in part 4, what we're looking at the planetary description given in Brihat Parasara Hora Sastra, and being that we're talking about the fourth planet, so we're looking at 4.4. The fourth planet is the planet of Mercury. So let's go ahead and let's look at Mercury. So what do we know about Mercury? We know that Mercury, we've talked about this. Mercury is a gentle but mixed planet, depending upon whether if he's by himself in a Rashi, he's going to be a gentle planet. If he's in a Rashi with gentle planets, he's going to act like a gentle planet. If he's in a Rashi with cruel planets, he's going to act like a cruel planet. So that's what we mean by gentle and mixed. And that's also because Mercury is neuter. He can act one way or act the other. He's the prince. We know that he's always looking sideways. He's rajasic. He's finding options, and he's doing it because it's the first house. He's building a better life for us. And then we also know that Mercury is represents our practical intelligence. And our practical intelligence is doing what? All of this stuff, looking sideways, the bird, making a better life for us, because Mercury is most excellent formed. So when we talk about the form of a planet, there's two different things that we can kind of look at. We can look at it metaphorically, and of course we will, because Mercury is representative of metaphorical speech. We'll talk about that in a second too. We'll even use some metaphors. Now, Mercury, when we talk about the form of a planet, like the sun being square, like the moon being round, like Mars being of torn form, and Mercury of most excellent formed. So there's a couple things that we can do with this, and I didn't really mention this in the first three because I didn't really think to. But if, let's say you have Sun in your ascendant, or Sun in Aries, something that has to do with the head. Well, possibly, or maybe more so Sun in Taurus, or Sun in the second house, or something that has to do with the face. What we can know about Sun is square, so possibly that means that your face and your chin has more of a square look to it. Or if the Sun is strongly aspecting your first house, like the strongest aspect to your Lagna degree is by that of Sun, then he might give you kind of that square form to it. So there's like a physical aspect of it. And what I did talk about is I talked metaphorically about the idea of Mercury, of all the planets of Sun, Moon, and Mars, of what we've talked about before, in a metaphorical context of kind of what the idea of Sun being square, Moon being round, Mars being of torn form. But those can be literal, they can represent themselves literally in life. When we talk about those type of people, like if we talk about somebody, you've got Sun in your fourth house, perhaps this is the case. This is not a guarantee. But if you have Sun in the fourth house, then perhaps your mother is of more of a solar quality. Maybe she's more square. Maybe she has a very square frame, very square shoulders. Something about her like that, because fourth house represents the mother. So that's one of the ways that we can look at it. So when Mercury is most excellently formed, maybe this makes someone a little bit more handsome. Maybe you look at this person and you're like, wow, that person's just very well put together. And so we also know that, so that's one way to look at it, is it can literally manifest these qualities in the world. But we can also look at these things metaphorically. So metaphorically speaking, like most excellent formed, or maybe not necessarily metaphorically speaking, we can see there's another way to interpret that definition of most excellent formed, that Mercury is always looking to create things in this life. We know that he's looking at the options. We know that he's being practical. He's being practical because he wants to find the most excellent option. He's always looking to make things better. Because we know he's always looking, because looking sideways and being rajasic means taking activity and looking from this way to this way and seeing what is there, right? And Mercury's form is that of the bird, so he's able to see how everything is put together, see how all the options are. And Mercury sees the options, and he tries the options, and he investigates the options, because he's trying to find a more excellent form, a better form. He's trying to better things. Mercury likes to improve upon that which there is. Mercury doesn't just, for no good reason, try all these options and follow curiosities. A lot of times his curiosities are like, it's from a very practical standpoint of like, how can I make this better? Maybe if instead of taking this route that I always take to work, perhaps if I take this route over here, and take this street to this street instead of taking the highway or something like that, you're thinking about doing that because it's a better way of going about things. And that's Mercury. It's like he's exploring those things to make things better. And so we know that Mercury is of metaphorical speech. So when I speak, I have Mercury in my 10th house, Mercury all alone in my 10th house. I use a lot of metaphors when I speak. So again, here's a literal interpretation of these Brihat Parasara descriptions of the planet. Because what metaphorical speech is you're able to, when you're speaking with a metaphor, you're talking about one thing, you're seeing how it works, but you're also seeing how this thing over here relates to it. And so I can better describe this thing because I can explain this situation. And that's kind of what the idea of a metaphor is giving a really proper description of something and giving a really good idea by relating it to something else. So if you were trying to describe why you do something and you're like, yeah, well, if I were to try and just describe why that you should do this particular path, if I just said, hey, yeah, you should go over here, you should take this street, but maybe it's better, because if this is what Mercury says, is maybe it's better that I give them a story about this king and how he found a better path or something like that. It sees that another way that I can describe this, which is probably more excellently formed. Another way to describe it is by finding something else that somebody can relate to and bringing that into the equation. And you'll see that I use metaphors a lot when I'm describing a lot of these qualities of the planets. I'll bring in another way of approaching it because that's a really practical, mercurial, intelligent nature, because Mercury sees all these different things, right? Looking sideways, the bird. Mercury sees all these things. It sees, when you have that perspective of seeing all these things, you can see how, oh, look, this thing over here is related to this thing over here. I can tell a story about this thing by describing the story of this thing. And so that's kind of the nature of Mercury. And that's also kind of Mercury's way of speaking, is of that way of not being, he can be direct, right? Because Mercury is, depending, if you put Mercury with Mars, you might get someone that's not really speaking in metaphors because they're acting like Mars. They're speaking directly. And so anyhow, so now let's go ahead and get on to the next quality of Mercury, which is taking pleasure in laughter. So taking pleasure in laughter. This is about enjoying humor and wit. This is about wanting to play games. This is the playful side of Mercury. That's really what Parasara is getting at here, is Mercury represents our sense of humor. Mercury represents our wit, and because Mercury wants to make people smile. I mean, when we're taking pleasure in laughter, a lot of times it's not like taking pleasure in laughing at somebody, it's laughing with other people. Because when we get into the karakas of the planets, we get into the karaka ships of the planets and what the planets are karakas for, what they're signifactors of in life, what we will see is Mercury is a karaka for fun, Mercury is a karaka for games, and Mercury is a karaka for friendship. And we will see taking pleasure in laughter, this idea of always making things better. That's a great quality for somebody who is making friends with. You want, typically, our friends are people that we have fun with, people who we share curiosities with, people who we share our interests or skill sets with. Those are all mercurial qualities. And so when we start understanding that more about Mercury, then that'll really start giving us a better understanding of why Mercury, knowing that he takes pleasure in laughter. Mercury represents our sense of humor. That's kind of, a lot of time, that's how we relate to our friends, is we make each other laugh or smile and stuff like that. And then when we see here, Mercury's of Pitta, Kapha, and Vata nature. Well, these are the three doshas, and these are all the three doshas. There's only three doshas that are represented. And what we can see with Mercury, we already know that Mercury has, I already talked about this at the very start of our descriptions here, and in part one, when I talked about Mercury, Grahas part one, we talked about how Mercury is a mixed planet depending on whether he's with cruel planets or gentle planets or by himself. So Mercury acts differently. All the other planets, like Moon and Venus, for example, are Kapha and Vata. And I described that with the Moon. I'll describe it again with Venus when we get to Venus's section, which will be section 4.6. Then we know that Jupiter's Kapha, Sun and Mars are Pitta, and Saturn is Vata. But none of the other planets other than Mercury are all three. And that's because Mercury can go between all three dashas. Because Mercury, being that he's looking sideways, being that he's neuter and doesn't really have a stake in the game as far as whether I'm just trying to be active and take what I believe out into the world and try and make what I want formed, or whether I'm just being more feminine and being more reactive to the world and creating needs and desires for what'll make me happy and finding contentment. Well, and Mercury's about neither of those things, because Mercury just wants to make things work. And so to make things work, to make something more excellently formed, Mercury is able to go between, he's able to change his nature between gentle and cruel. He's able to go between all three doshas. Mercury is going to provide some Kapha, which Kapha can mean contentment, can mean happiness. And then it's going to be Vata, which Vata can be a very creative energy. And it can be Pitta, and Pitta is very much a managing energy of making things happen. And Mercury, this is kind of where we get the idea of Mercury, is Mercury's got a goal of all of these, of all the natures of the doshas. Mercury has a say because because what is he doing? He's making something more excellently formed. So he's going to use whatever he can. He's going to act, and he's very mutable. I always think of Mercury as like, Mercury doesn't have one set way of going about it. His set way of going about it is making it the best and having fun going about doing what it is that he does. So this is the start. This is what Brihat Parasara Hora Sastra. This is what Parashara says about Mercury. This is my interpretation of it, and this is not the end, and this is still just the beginning of the understanding. Take it, and whatever you think about it, add to the comment section below here, or just keep investigating on your own. I'm going to keep posting more videos. We're going to fill up our whole word cloud here, and the more and more that we dive into exploring what these planets represent and exploring what Mercury represents. And then finally, we're going to talk about what all the planets are karakas for. When we start seeing Mercury and what Mercury is karaka for, what Mercury represents, then we're really going to see why that is when we understand these qualities of Mercury. So anyhow, thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and namaste.